Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jennifer Stevens, and I am the Director of the Department of Arts and History for the City of Boise. We are thrilled to have you with us tonight for a couple of our, we're so excited about the speakers that we have that came down from the University of Idaho to give you some great history about the Asian population in Boise. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you to Maureen Lavelle. She is the History Programs Manager for the city, and she'll introduce our speakers. So thank you again so much for coming tonight.
Good evening. Again, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm just curious. I'd like to know now at the beginning of each of our forums, for how many of you is this the first Fettuccine Forum that you've attended? Oh, welcome. Oh, great. Okay, thank you so much. Well, whether you're joining us for the first time or you are a seasoned Fettuccine Forum veteran, thank you for supporting this event. We are especially grateful to have support from the Office of the Mayor, from Boise State Public Radio, and the Department of History at Boise State University. We also want to say thank you to our hosts here at Trailhead for use of this great venue. And also, if you haven't visited them already, John is working the bar tonight from Joe's Traveling Bar, so please feel free to stop by for some refreshments. The City of Boise and the Department of Arts and History, we are so fortunate to have all these community partners here to help us put on this great event, but truly, the success, the longevity of the Fettuccine Forum, all of that is due to you who attend these events, who support us. You make it all possible, and thank you. We look forward to so many more years of great conversations and gatherings together. We also encourage you, if you like events like these, like the forum and other events that we do with our department, we encourage you to donate to the Boise City Arts and History Heritage Fund. These funds support all kinds of activities put on by the department, including programming, archiving efforts that we do, history and art exhibitions throughout the city, and support of our different cultural sites throughout the city. There is a donation box at the front entrance at the table. And if you have any questions, there is more information on our website, boiseartsandhistory.org, or you can speak to one of us here running the event this evening. And before I introduce our two speakers, I do want to remind everybody that this event is being recorded. It will be available to you in the coming days to view online. And it's also a hybrid event, which means that we actually have people tuning in right now via Zoom. We like to make special mention of our friends at the Treasure Valley YMCA. They are hosting several viewing parties throughout the valley, so thank you. And if any of you ever want to attend an event like the Fettuccine Forum, but you can't make it in person, if you visit our website, boiseartsandhistory.org, there are instructions on how to attend via Zoom. And for our online audience tonight, there are auto-generated captions available that you can view if you click the button at the bottom of your screen that says live transcript and then select show subtitles. You'll get that feature as well. Tonight at the end of our presentation, there will be a moderated Q&A. So please, if you could, please hold your questions to the end. For those of you on Zoom, there is a Q&A feature available where you could submit questions even throughout the talk, and our moderators here in person will collect those and pass them along to me. Here in our audience, at the end of our talk, our history programs assistant, Caitlin, will be around to collect your questions and relay them to me. And then, of course, I'll send them along to our speakers. Our speakers have also invited folks in our audience tonight. At the end of the presentation, they have brought artifacts, books, and items related to the collection that they manage up at the University of Idaho. And they invite you to come take a closer look and ask questions about those at the end of their talk. And also, finally, for our in-person audience, if you would not mind, please take a moment now to silence your cell phones so that they will be quiet during our presentations. And again, before I introduce our speakers, I do want to speak for a moment about the theme that's driving our 20th anniversary of the Fettuccine Forum. Let's talk about Boise. So for years, as many of you know, Boise has undergone some rapid growth, big changes, and our community, in many senses of that word, has expanded, has diversified, has changed. And all of those transformations have sparked some really great conversations about the identity of this city. And many people who have recently moved to Boise, they might have preconceived notions about the history, the culture, the character of our community, some accurate, maybe some inaccurate. And what we hope to accomplish with this season of the Fettuccine Forum is to look inward at some of Boise's historic people, historic cultures, the factors that all comprise Boise's identity, and how all those driving forces have shaped our community and will continue to influence the future of this city. Also, before our presentation tonight, I would like to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people in the Boise Valley. Whether or not Boise is a familiar place for a long time, it is important for all of us to recognize and understand that there has been an interplay of both human and environmental forces that have shaped this community for centuries, that they are still at work and they will continue to influence our common interests and the future that we all envision. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers and their presentation tonight, the Treasure Valley's Asian Pioneers, Archaeology and History of Asian Americans in Boise and the Vicinity. First, Dr. Priscilla Wegars founded the University of Idaho's Asian American Comparative Collection, which is a unique resource of artifacts, images, and documentary materials, which are essential for understanding Asian American archaeological sites, economic contributions, and cultural history. She has published many, many books, including most recently, Polly Bemis, The Life and Times of a Chinese American Pioneer. Our second speaker is Renae Campbell, a research associate for the Asian American Comparative Collection, and she has a background in cultural resource management and has worked as an archaeologist throughout the West and Pacific Northwest. For her Ph.D. dissertation, Renae worked to analyze archaeological collections from the late 19th and early 20th century Chinese mining sites in Idaho's Boise Basin. Now, as many of you may know, if you've been following the Fettuccine Forum advertisements online, we post the events and biographies of our speakers way in advance. But I have learned that a couple weeks ago, Renae, well, when we wrote about her, when we published her biography, she was listed as a doctoral candidate at the University of Idaho, but a couple of weeks ago, she defended her dissertation. She has officially earned her Ph.D. in historical archaeology. And so I'm very excited, yes. So with that, I am very excited to welcome our speakers, Dr. Priscilla Wegars and Dr. Renae Campbell.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction. Does the mic sound okay? Okay. Yeah, I think so. Okay. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. We are really excited to come down and be here with you. Before I want to get started, I also want to kind of briefly express my gratitude to everyone who has helped put this event together. Many thanks are due to the Boise City Department of Arts and History staff, particularly Hannah Gardowski, Alicia Grafe, Danielle Grundle, Caitlin Hocklander, Maureen Lavelle, Jennifer Stevens, Jillian Whitehill, Jennifer Yabar, and Mackenzie Dunstan. And of course, anyone whose name I've inadvertently forgotten to include in that list. And then I also want to give two quick disclaimers about our talk tonight. The first is that this is a truly thanks. Sorry, this is a truly huge and diverse topic, so please know that while trying to give a broad overview of 150 years in the Treasure Valley, we recognize that Asian American history is not one singular narrative, but rather a conglomerate of unique histories. Although we have tried to include as many different aspects as possible, due to time and space constraints, we have undoubtedly left out many fascinating and important stories, which is why we've brought a few additional resources. And then lastly, because of the historical materials that we are working from, I wanted to warn you. Can I do that? Oh, there we go. I wanted to warn you that there will be some racist terminology in tonight's presentation. You won't hear Priscilla or me voice it. but we will have left it in just a few slide images. This is not to condone such language, but rather to highlight the bravery of those who stood against this racist sentiment as they created homes and lives in southern Idaho. So with that, I'll get rolling and hopefully we can leave some time for questions at the end. Since long before regional boosterism designated Boise and its vicinity the Treasure Valley, Asian Americans have been part of the area's multicultural history. The first Asian residents, in fact, preceded not just the regional nickname, but also the creation of the territory that we now know as Idaho. By the 1860s, Chinese miners like this man up here, Wan Ying, joined gold rushes attracting fortune seekers from around the globe to what was still then Washington Territory. Like most of the approximately 400,000 Chinese migrants to enter the American West in the 19th century, Wan Ying had been born in Guangdong province, a relatively small region of southern China with well-established connections to trans-Pacific trade and family-supported traditions of traveling overseas for work. Those traditions, along with a period of acute political and social upheaval, contributed to the formation of large diasporic networks of Chinese migrants who traveled throughout the Pacific while maintaining close ties to their home villages in Guangdong. Members of this Chinese diaspora left an indelible mark on the American West, traces of which can be found at archaeological sites, in modern cities and landscapes, in oral or family histories, and in historical documents. Wan Ying, for example, told his story to the Idaho Statesman in 1931, recounting that he was among the first non-native people to settle in southern Idaho's Boise Basin. Located within, or by some definitions, just east of the Treasure Valley, the Boise Basin, along with mining camps in central and southern Idaho, played a crucial role in Boise's founding and early growth, because Boise and the basin are within the traditional homelands of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Paiute peoples who used the region as part of their seasonal round and trade routes. These same trade routes were later used by fur trappers and migrants on the Oregon Trail and positioned Boise as a supply center on the way to Idaho's gold fields, especially the Boise Basin. Thus, both places grew in tandem, though Boise, at least initially, did so at a much more meager pace. In 1863, as Congress created the Idaho Territory, a community of roughly 725 settlers platted the first Boise city town site. That same year, the Boise Basin's population swelled to more than 14,000 residents, making it briefly one of the largest population centers in the Pacific Northwest. While we don't know if Wan Ying's prospecting party passed through Boise on their way to the basin, many other thousands of miners did. According to research by historian Li-Ping Zhu, Chinese miners in particular tended to follow the overland trail from California to Idaho, trekking through Boise with a regularity noted by residents and in local newspapers. In September of 1865, for example, the Idaho Statesman commented on, quote, "that interesting sight so familiar to old Californians of long trains of Chinese miners on the move in a single file, supporting the middle of their long-handled shovels or bamboo sticks with pendant sacks of rice, chopsticks, rockers, and gum boots," which were rubber boots, important things for mining. While some of these miners worked for European Americans, others pooled resources to form large cooperative companies that included a workforce specialized in digging ditches, operating hydraulic water cannons like the one you see here, overseeing crews, and maintaining tools and equipment. Though these miners worked and lived on claims dispersed throughout Idaho, they maintained ties with home villages in China, with other populations of Western miners, and with Treasure Valley communities. Some of these historical connections can be seen through mining innovations. Chinese technology, for example, like the undershot water wheel, which is shown here, were widely adopted within the American mining industry. State Mine Inspector Robert Bell also noted Idaho's Chinese miners, quote, "ingenious bucket, belt, elevator, and pumping devices." One particularly strong piece of evidence linking Chinese miners in the Boise vicinity to miners in the north and east comes from an archaeological site leased by Boise Basin miner Charlie Sing Lee, who I will return to later in this presentation. Here, artifacts indicate that Chinese blacksmiths were creating a distinctive type of fortified mining pick found only in the Boise, Clearwater, and Malheur national forests. Innovations like these helped Chinese miners to persist through the boom and bust cycles of a notoriously uncertain industry. But while their skills and creativity significantly contribute to the economy on which most Treasure Valley communities relied, Chinese miners were also the target of discrimination. Stoked by fears of labor competition and of the political power Chinese migrants might hold if granted the same rights as other immigrants, anti-Chinese racism spread across the West in the 1860s. At its worst, it erupted into physical violence. Regionally, this included lynchings in Pierce and the massacre of 34 Chinese miners along the Snake River. Serious incidents also occurred in the Treasure Valley. In 1865, for example, a laundryman was murdered in Idaho City. 1 year later, 3 European American men killed a Chinese woman in Pioneer City, also in the Boise Basin, shooting her through the door of her own home. Other less violent, but still widely felt effects of this movement were a series of legal actions. Like many other Western states, Idaho passed laws that imposed extra taxes on Chinese residents and prohibited them from voting, serving as jurors, holding civil office, or owning property at different points in time. Boise's Anti-Chinese League also attempted to drive Chinese residents out of the Treasure Valley by recruiting white women from out of state to take the jobs in the laundry or domestic service industry, but never rallied enough support to be effective. In response, many Chinese Idahoans developed strategies to protect themselves or to circumvent or challenge unfair laws, some of which were struck down in Idaho's courts. And at the national level, unfortunately, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act imposed sweeping restrictions on Chinese immigrants and singled Chinese immigrants out as ineligible for citizenship. Renewals and amendments to this act created a constantly shifting and often precarious legal status for most Chinese Idahoans that also set the precedent for other Asian immigrants in the decades that followed. Despite this deeply unequal and potentially volatile landscape, by 1870, the Idaho Territory had more than 4,000 Chinese residents who together represented nearly 30% of the total population, and at the time comprised the largest percentage per capita of any U.S. state or territory. Nearly 2,000 of these Chinese Idahoans lived in the Boise Basin, where they accounted for just under half of the local community. Though most worked as miners, others found employment providing essential goods and services. This is evident in census data, which records 28 different occupations held by Chinese residents, including merchants, clerks, barbers, butchers, doctors, porters, cooks, carpenters, cobblers, blacksmiths, gardeners, interpreters, and peddlers of all sorts. Despite arriving in smaller numbers and facing disproportionately restrictive legal and social barriers, Chinese women and children were also a member of Treasure Valley communities. By 1870, at least 54 Chinese women and 10 Chinese children, one of whom can be, maybe depending on where you're sitting in here, seen sitting on someone's lap in this photo, were living in the basin. Census data describe Chinese women in the basin as members of households that operated stores, restaurants, groceries, or laundries, and most single Chinese women as prostitutes or placer miners, though these last two designations were very likely inflated. Census data records far fewer Chinese living within Boise city limits at the time, just 65 year-round residents, including 14 women among a population of about 1,000 who worked primarily in the laundry business, but also as cooks in private households or hotels, and in one instance as a physician. Contemporary maps indicate that by the mid-1870s, a small Chinatown had developed along Idaho Street near its intersection with 8th. In the Boise Basin, business districts also appeared in many towns and were often anchored by long-running Chinese stores that served as hubs for both social and commercial activity. In Idaho City, for example, historical and archaeological evidence has shown that businesses run by family members of prominent merchants Pan Yam and Lock Key were a one-stop shop where locals procured supplies, purchased hot meals, and found information about work and housing prospects. Providing so many goods and services required Chinese merchants to maintain a variety of contacts. The most distant of these were import-export companies known as Gold Mountain firms that were based in Hong Kong and supplied an immense amount of goods to merchants across North America. Treasure Valley's Chinese merchants also built networks of regional suppliers and often looked to Boise for both goods and labor. Pan Yam, for example, who ran a store that still stands in Idaho City, regularly traveled to Boise to buy merchandise. Members of the Lock Key family also did business with contacts in Boise. Records of many of these transactions are preserved in a letter book curated at the Idaho State Archives. Written by Lock Key's daughter, Dai Tai, who conducted the family's English language business, the correspondence in this book indicates orders placed from Boise businesses like the Falk Block Mercantile, whose store and warehouses stood just outside of Boise's Chinatown and not far from us here tonight on 8th Street. Several of these letters show Dai Tai's family members requesting to have packages shipped through the Union Pacific Railroad and delivered to the Falk Block Mercantile for pickup or transfer to Stagecoach. These letters in particular indicate that Boise-based contacts often served as intermediaries between more distant suppliers and Idaho's Chinese merchants. Not just merchandise flowed between Boise and the basin, however. In 1881, the Idaho Statesman reported on a rumor that Panyam had received a large lumber contract, which would soon employ nearly all of Boise's Chinese residents. Though this contract was later revealed to be a hoax perpetuated by Chinese cooks in the city to negotiate better wages, this newspaper article was not published until after many had already received their wages raised. We received their raises. So the reason that this rumor was believable, though, was because Panyam did oversee large contracts and was known to have paid fair wages. In the basin, Panyam's mining contracts set wage scales at levels consistent with his Chinese and non-Chinese contemporaries. Fewer documents related to his lumber contracts exist, but they include this bid list recorded in the 1894 meeting notes of the Boise Mining Company. And here you can see Panyam's name midway down a list of contractors, along with a bid that was higher than 2 of his 3 competitors. J.H. Weeks was awarded this contract, but newspaper articles indicate that Panyam's crews found work elsewhere. Along the Crooked River, Panyam's woodcutters worked into the winter through temperatures that fell below zero to meet the needs of Boise's market. Comprised of homes and businesses that relied on wood for heating and cooking, this market also likely included Chinese launderers. Laundering was one of the first jobs taken up by Treasure Valley's Chinese immigrants. In Boise, Chinese laundries were a fixture of Chinatown, which by the 1880s featured buildings clad in iron or tin to protect against fire danger. Fires were a concern shared by many during this period, but were especially worrisome for laundry workers who, in order to heat the water and irons they used in their profession, often kept fires burning continuously. In 1881, it was reported that Boise's Chinese launderers were paying between $120 and $150 annually for firewood. In Payette, the real but also racially charged fear of fires led to a petition to move all Chinese laundries out of town. In Boise, it resulted in ordinances banning laundries within a central fire district whose boundaries also just happened to include Chinatown. In 1892, a number of Boise's Chinese launderers were arrested under these rezoning laws, and all were required to find new retail space in stone or brick buildings. Despite these shifting regulations, some Chinese laundry workers still found ways to make their enterprises profitable and long-lasting. One Chinese Boisean, Singhai, was reported to have accumulated over $14,000 in savings from his local laundry business. Historian Arthur Hart, in his seminal book on Boise's Chinatown, which is up here on the table for those of you in this room, found that this Chinese laundry, operated by Chong Sing, persisted in nearly the same location for 30 years or more. In that time, workers at Chong Sing's laundry would have witnessed a number of changes in their neighborhood. As mining profits in the basin began to wane, Boise's population growth outpaced its neighbors to the east. By the 1880s, Boise's Chinatown was the largest in the Intermountain West. Among its new residents was the noted Boise doctor C.K. Afong, who established practices in Atlanta and Rocky Bar before settling in Boise. Since Afong was the subject of a previous Fettuccine Forum last year, I won't go into great detail about him here. You'll just have to read Tamara Vennett Shelton's excellent book, Herbs and Roots, to learn more about that. But I will say that through a series of legal battles, Afong successfully challenged discriminatory licensing requirements in the state to become a fully accredited physician and surgeon in Idaho. Afong may have been the first fully licensed Chinese physician in Boise, but he was far from the only purveyor of Chinese medicines. Maps of buildings identified as Chinese drugstores and property records that include inventories of Chinese medicines indicate their prevalence in both the basin and in Boise. In the latter, the Yik Yi family operated the Goon Hoi Chinese Herb Company for several decades on the same block as the long-running Chongqing Laundry. In addition to being a place where Boiseans of all backgrounds sought services like laundering or medical treatment, Boise's Chinatown served a critical role as a place to congregate, socialize, practice shared customs, and seek reprieve from everyday discrimination faced by those living within its boundaries and outside of it. As early as the 1870s, a Chinese temple was established within Boise's Idaho Street Chinatown, often labeled with the less accurate term Joss House on historical maps like this one. Chinese temples are places where members of the Chinese diaspora participated in religious observances like paying respects to gods and ancestors. Boise's Chinese temple, which would later move to Front Street along with many Chinatown businesses, was also the site of social gatherings and community services, sometimes drawing worshipers from the Boise Basin. Holidays were also a time when Boise's Chinatown drew large crowds, particularly the Lunar New Year. A time of celebration and renewal, Lunar New Year was observed by Boise's residents through parades, gift-giving, music, lion or dragon dances, and firecrackers. As the largest Chinatown in the area, Boise's celebrations attracted residents from all over the Treasure Valley and from as far away as La Grande, Oregon. New Year's celebrations also extended into other parts of the city. A 1908 article in the Idaho Statesman, for instance, described preparations during which, quote, row after row of wagons were backed up against the doors of principal Chinatown shops and filled with goods like sugared coconut and candied orange peel to be taken to the Chinese vegetable gardens where they will be consumed during the New Year's holiday. Chinese gardeners had entered the Treasure Valley's productive market by at least 1870 and soon supplied restaurants, markets, and private homes, sometimes as far away as Butte, Montana. By the 1890s, this business was so extensive that the Statesman reported, quote, strangers visiting Boise remark on the scarcity of private vegetable gardens, noting that backyards are kept here for lawns, flowers, and trees, since this want is now supported by the Chinese market gardeners who raise vegetables and bring them fresh every morning to the door, charging only a reasonable price. Elderly gardeners Young Tao and Song Li each took up gardening after 3 decades of mining in the Boise Basin and Silver City, respectively. This was also the case for Louis Asu, a former Boise Basin miner turned gardener, whose descendants would operate the Louis Yi Garden until 1964. Like many of their fellow Chinese gardeners, members of the Louis family initially leased their land from Boise's prominent Davis family. Once containing more than 700 acres of what the Statesman describes as fine land in the Boise Valley, much of the Davis estate would eventually become parts of Julia Davis Park and Garden City, evicting Chinese gardeners in the process. A lucky few Chinese gardeners were able to purchase farms. Mabel Kwong, who was interviewed by Jackie Day Ames in the 1970s, was the first Chinese agriculturalist to buy property in Eagle, where she became known for her strawberries. Interviews conducted by the Department of Arts and Histories just this year provide insight into how gardeners like the Kwongs managed to remain financially solvent despite periods of strict Chinese exclusion and the Great Depression. In one interview, Boyd and Grant Yi recalled family members explaining that Chinese farmers would each agree to distribute their products to a different section of Boise so that competition would not drive down prices. Thanks in part to this cooperation, the Kwongs became one of a handful of multi-generational families like the Fongs, Louis, and Yis who defied decades of Chinese exclusion to remain in the Treasure Valley. Not all Chinese gardeners were able to establish such long-lasting enterprises, however. Charlie Sing Lee, a basin miner I mentioned earlier, also relocated to Boise in the early 20th century to enter the gardening trade. Charlie had been born in Idaho in 1870, and in the 1910s became president of Boise's Hop Sing Tong. Sometimes also called the Chinese Freemasons, social organizations like the Hop Sing Tong were primarily mutual aid societies. Researchers have documented, for example, that Tongs frequently took the lead in dispensing aid, advocating for rights, organizing boycotts, and challenging discriminatory laws. In some cases, however, Chinese Tongs also participated in illegal activities that disproportionately made European American newspaper headlines. In Boise, the two most active social organizations were the Hop Sing Tong and the Hip Sing Tong, both of which operated out of brick buildings in downtown Boise. In 1917, they were drawn into a national rivalry when Charlie Singley's cousin, Wan Boxing, was murdered by members of the opposing Hip Sing Tong. Thanks in part to Charlie Singley's testimony, both assailants were sentenced to life in prison. In 1921, Charlie Singley himself was arrested along with Mr. and Mrs. Zimmerman for selling cocaine, morphine, and yenshi, an opium derivative. He was sentenced to 20 months in the Ada County Jail, where staff described him as a model prisoner until a stroke ended both his prison sentence and his life. A resident of the Treasure Valley from birth to death, Charlie Singley's life was not one so easily defined by either triumph over adversity or by victimhood and tragedy, two exaggerated extremes that are often used to describe 19th century Chinese American experiences. In the Boise Basin, there we go. In the Boise Basin, sites leased by Charlie Singley are among the dozens of archaeological resources, managed by the Boise National Forest. Materials recovered from these sites include many mining artifacts like this gold blowing pan. There's also one up here, but also other artifacts that capture aspects of Chinese migrants' daily lives. Suspender clasps and rivets, for example, give us a sense of what they wore. Chinese cleavers and English dishes express ways they cooked and set their table. Bone toothbrush handles suggest how they attended to their health, and glass gaming pieces allude to activities that might have filled whatever free time they had when not working. Many others are direct correlates to artifacts found in the location of Boise's former Chinatown. Now we can have that slide. These investigations, which took place in the 1980s as part of the Boise Redevelopment Archaeological Project conducted by Timothy Jones and others from the University of Idaho, recovered close to 12,000 artifacts. Notable among these are finds are additional examples of Chinese ceramics, like these stoneware jars, which would have held foodstuffs like pickled ginger, two small colorless medicine vials that might have been purchased at a local Chinese store or recommended by a local Chinese physician, and a Four Seasons flowers dish, which includes an owner modification known as a peck mark, created by making small holes in the glaze on the dish. Unlike archaeological collections from the Boise Basin, materials unearthed from Boise's historical Chinatown excavations also include Japanese ceramics. Because no large-scale excavations have yet been conducted at Japanese American sites in Boise, these, along with a single sherd of Japanese porcelain recovered by archaeologist Bill White at the multi-ethnic River Street neighborhood, are some of the only material remains related to Boise's non-Chinese American Asian pioneers, who my colleague Priscilla is now going to tell you about.
Thank you, Renae. Okay, sound check. You can hear me in the back. Okay, too loud? Not too loud? Not too loud. Okay, thank you very much. All right. All right, and then this points and I do it that way. All right. Tell me if I'm, tell me if I mess up. Information on other Asian pioneers in the Treasure Valley, particularly ones of Japanese ancestry, together with a few of Korean and Filipino descent, has come mainly from newspaper stories in the Idaho Statesman. Oh, I think I need to start the slide. What? Oh, I see. Oh, thank you. Saying I need help. I need a lot of help. Okay.
Those ones are slow because they've got so many images on them.
Oh, okay.
They just take a little while.
There we go. Oh, back. Okay, that's the first slide. Okay, has come mainly from newspaper stories in the Idaho Statesman, as well as a couple of articles there by historian Arthur Hart. And again, we have his book on the table for you to look at. Decades of scholarly research on the Japanese in Idaho by the late Robert Bob Sims. Family histories by Mary Fuji Henshaw and by Heidi Smith Takatori. And from Carol Simon Smolinski's report for Idaho's ethnic heritage, also there for you to look at. Produced for Idaho's centennial in 1990. Thanks also to Renae Campbell for solving technical issues. And you see, I still have problems. And to Jennifer Stevens, Maureen Lavelle, Caitlin Hocklander, and Angie Davis for help with illustrations and research. Apologies to anyone who should have been mentioned here and acknowledged, but isn't. The late 1880s to early 1890s began to see the arrival of Japanese immigrants into Idaho, especially single men, mainly in response to the continuing need for workers, particularly on railroads, following passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. In early May 1892, for example, the Statesman reported a train carload of Japanese immigrants arrived recently in Nampa. On what was then a holiday in Japan, many drank more alcohol than was customary for them. A pistol shot rang out at about 6 p.m., and 2 of them were seen dragging a fellow man into the house. The newspaper could not learn if anyone was injured because they refused to talk. In late June 1892, another 104 Japanese men arrived at Nampa, with 400 to 450 more expected within a week. Once here, the Japanese would face much of the same anti-Asian hostility already endured by their Chinese immigrant predecessors. At least by early July 1892, anti-Japanese prejudice was becoming noticeable in the Treasure Valley. On July 8, a number of Japanese laborers were run out of Mountain Home. As the Statesman reported, during the past few months, these pestilent little yellow men have almost wholly superseded white section hands, and they are fairly flocking into this part of the state. Much bitterness has been engendered against them. They are no more desirable than the Chinese, being just as miserly and much filthier, end quote. In late July 1892, several Japanese men in Nampa were found to have contracted smallpox. This scare led to the immediate ouster there of numerous Japanese, mostly railroad workers, and 2 Chinese laundrymen. Most were rounded up into a quarantine encampment outside of Nampa. Caldwell followed suit, evicting its Japanese residents and a Chinese gardener, accusing him of having leprosy. In all, some 150 Chinese were banished from those 2 cities. In response, the Japanese workers' employer, the Union Pacific Railroad, threatened to prosecute the group that had run the Japanese out. The railroad sided with their Japanese employees mainly because the expulsion left the Euro-American section bosses with no help and with the additional responsibility of ensuring track safety on their own. Some of the Nampa Japanese went to Boise, where their arrival caused considerable excitement. The mayor authorized the police to force any non-resident Japanese to leave. Boise's Chinese residents expressed alarm, fearing that if the Japanese brought smallpox into the city, they, as well as the Japanese, would be run out by a mob. The expulsion even included Japanese courtesan in David Levy's House of Holy Horrors, meaning his house of prostitution on Main Street. The slide shows a number of buildings labeled female boarding, or FB. This was a euphemism for a house of prostitution. In an excess of yellow journalism, the Statesman continued, quote, "If the disease appears anywhere in this city, it will be right in that neighborhood where the germs of the disease will join hands with the bacteria of filth and go waltzing about the mildewed rooms in a ghastly dance of death." Don't you wish they still wrote about like that in the newspapers today? Even the Japanese consul in San Francisco became involved, writing to Idaho's Governor Willie for information regarding the recent expulsion of Japanese, and the governor promised to allay the fears of the consul. Indeed, within 2 weeks, the smallpox scare was over, likely due to pressure from the Union Pacific Railroad, from the Japanese consul, and by the fact that no more cases developed. In early August 1892, the railroad welcomed the expelled Japanese section hands back to work. Besides working for the railroads, the Japanese in the Treasure Valley were engaged in other occupations, often as cooks. The earliest known Japanese restaurant there was probably the Chop House, operated in Nampa in 1892 by a man named Tanaka. Tanaka also ran an employment bureau, so his restaurant's patrons were most likely railroad employees. In Boise, in March 1898, an experienced first-class Japanese cook advertised that he was available for work in a hotel. In 1901, another Japanese cook sought work with a family or in a boarding house. In Emmett, in 1905, there were some Japanese gardeners, a Japanese laundry opened, And Japanese carpenters were remodeling rooms in the Emmett Hotel for a new restaurant. Names of various Japanese men who ran or worked at restaurants in Boise can be found in Boise city directories between 1905 and 1909. When the Boise High School Annex was built in 1912, some Japanese in Boise were awarded a contract to do the excavation. By 1907, increasing numbers of Japanese immigrants were arriving, not always legally, Escalating tensions and conflicts and resulting diplomacy between US and Japan led to the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907-1908. This was an informal arrangement to calm tensions between the two countries, particularly pertaining to immigration. It called for US President Roosevelt to force San Francisco to repeal its then segregated school system, which prohibited children of Japanese ancestry from attending school with Euro-American children. In exchange, Japan agreed to deny immigration passports to Japanese laborers while still allowing wives, children, and parents of current immigrants to enter the United States. Japanese men who could afford it, such as Henry Fuji of Nampa, traveled back to Japan to marry. Those who couldn't afford it had their families in Japan select a suitable woman, following which the prospective couple exchanged photos. If they agreed, they were married by proxy in Japan, and the picture bride set off for the difficult month-long ship journey to Portland or Seattle. In researching her husband's family, Heidi Smith Takatori learned from the 1900 U.S. Census that her husband's great-grandfather, Jisaburo Jim Takatori, was living in Boise in 1900 in a boarding house with 200 Japanese men, presumably other railroad workers. He had come over from Japan to work, leaving his wife and young son behind. Later, he worked in the kitchen of the Idaho Hotel and then opened his own restaurant in Boise. In 1914, his wife, Hina, immigrated from Japan. In 1915, in honor of her arrival, Jim built the first, and this is a quote, the first genuine Japanese garden to be seen in Boise, creating mountains, waterfalls, lakes, woodland dells, and watchtowers in an area only a few feet square in the front yard of their home, also their restaurant. Later in 1917, they sent for their grown son, Kanami or Fred. The family then moved to Parma, where they opened a restaurant and ran it until 1929. In the meantime, Fred had returned to Japan in 1921 to marry an arranged bride, Kazue. Fred brought Kazue home to Parma, where the couple had 5 children between 1921 and 1932. Sugar beet farming was another occupation that hired many Japanese men. In 1906, a factory for processing sugar beets was built in Nampa, and the company hired Japanese laborers to work there. In the following year, one sugar beet farm hired a Japanese contractor to arrange for workers to undertake the very laborious, labor-intensive tasks of planting, cultivating, thinning, and harvesting the sugar beets. Some farms employed both Japanese and Korean workers. Very little else is known about Korean pioneers in the Treasure Valley, and some of it is unflattering. In April 1911, for example, an altercation in Boise between Louis Fong, a Chinese man, and Y.S. Lee, a Korean, led to Lee having Fong arrested, charged with assault with intent to kill and with carrying concealed weapons, while Fong had Lee arrested and charged with assault to rob. A large group of Koreans had recently arrived in Boise and reportedly had openly threatened certain prominent Chinese men with death in the event they did not come through with money. Further on, not shown here, the Statesman story also mentions 2 other Koreans, Lee's roommates, who worked nights at Boise's Owyhee Hotel. In 1911, an upcoming trial in Pocatello also focused attention on Boise's Korean residents. In a case of guilt by association, they were suspected of being involved in the white slave trade, described as the nefarious work of trafficking in American women for immoral purposes. Boise police were thus keeping close account of the Koreans, and the Japanese were also being investigated. Other newspaper stories mentioning Koreans included details of their lives and occupations. In late 1934, a Korean gardener in Eagle, C.O. Lim, was shot and killed by a Euro-American man in an argument during a poker game with whiskey and high stakes. Lim had lived in the vicinity of Eagle for a number of years and had recently been employed by another Korean, W.C. Orr, who operated a number of truck gardens in the Eagle district. At the inquest, Orr testified to having participated in the fatal poker game. As you may know, between 1864 and 1887, Idaho had miscegenation laws making it a misdemeanor for any Euro-American person to intermarry or cohabit with any African-American, Native American, or Chinese person. By 1887, the law only prohibited marriage between Euro-Americans and African-Americans. In 1921, however, in response to Japanese immigration into Idaho, Mongolians were added back in as another prohibited group. Henry Fuji's daughter, Mary Fuji Henshaw, had personal experience with that biased legislation. She remembered it as one that was intended to forbid Japanese from marrying Caucasians to, quote, keep these yellow savage heathens from marrying our young people, end quote. And this racist law was not repealed until 1959. Despite the fact that most of them intended to settle in America permanently, newly arriving people of Asian ancestry, like the Chinese immigrants before them, were not allowed to become American citizens, no matter how long they had lived here, how well they spoke English, or how Americanized they had become. After California passed a law in 1913 forbidding aliens ineligible for naturalization from buying land, other states soon began to follow suit with their own anti-alien laws. Idaho tried and failed in 1917 and 1921, but succeeded in 1923. Although people of Japanese ancestry were not actually mentioned in the law, it mainly applied to them. Some evaded this restriction by putting the land in the name of one of their children who had been born in the U.S. and thus had American citizenship, or by entering into a lease agreement with a sympathetic Euro-American seller. This was the case for Parma's Takatori family. Fred, Kazue, and their older children moved to a 75-acre farm there about 1925, first with a lease. By 1930, the farm was in the name of their eldest son, Tommy, just 8 years old. And that was a common practice throughout the Treasure Valley until 1952, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that various states' anti-alien laws were unconstitutional. Members of the Takatori family still own the farm in Parma. By the time Portland's Japanese consul visited Boise in 1915, there were only about 20 residents of Japanese ancestry still living there. One prominent family was the Yamamotos. They participated in many local activities and were highly respected in both the Euro-American community and among local Japanese residents. Tokunosuke Yamamoto, a chef and restaurant owner, was born in Japan in 1885 and came to Boise about 1920 after living in Caldwell and Nampa. His family included his wife, Koharu, their daughter, Sumi, and their sons, Jun and Joe. The family's first mention in the Statesman was on January 9, 1921, reporting on a Japanese New Year's party that was held in their home on Hayes Street in Boise. Callers came from as far away as Pocatello and Idaho Falls and included all the members of the Japanese colony of Boise, many from Nampa, and a few privileged American friends. Most of the guests were served just tea and snacks, but at high noon, a real Japanese feast was served by Koharu and Sumi to a table of 4 Euro-American women and to another table of 3 young Japanese men from Nampa and the host, who was Sumi's father. It is tempting to speculate that the 3 young men were potential suitors for Sumi. In the next few years, the Yamamotos were sometimes in the news, usually for the parents' participation in civic activities. For example, Tokunosuke Yamamoto's local prominence was heightened when, in April 1927, he hosted the Japanese consul from Portland during a brief visit, introduced him to Idaho's governor, and then took him to the Chamber of Commerce and other points of interest. Another newspaper story mentioned that Tokunosuke gave a short talk on Japan for the Americanization Night School when the school year ended in 1927. In 1928, the Yamamoto's daughter Sumi rated a lengthy article in the Statesman. By then a graduate of Boise High School and of Linfield College in McMinnville, Oregon, Sumi was lauded for her work among the Japanese girls in the branch of the YWCA in the Japanese section of San Francisco. Sumi's marriage in September 1931 to Sterling Tatsuji Takeuchi, a graduate of Northwestern University and a researcher at the University of Chicago, was also newsworthy. The Statesman reported that the bride wore a princess frock of white silk lace made on long clinging lines with a chic little jacket of summer ermine and a small brown hat to match. Oddly, and I don't understand why, they were married in Vail, Oregon, in the presence of the family by the Reverend Frederick Shields, pastor of Boise's First Baptist Church. The party returned at once to Boise, where the young couple went to the Hotel Boise. The following Wednesday, the newlyweds were to sail from Seattle to Tokyo, where Mr. Takeuchi will engage in writing his second book in connection with his research work. The couple, who had both been born in Japan, moved there permanently, since without being U.S. citizens, their opportunities in the U.S. were very limited. By June 1932, Sumi was pregnant, so her mother, Koharu, set sail from Seattle to Japan. A boy, Kenzie, was born in early September, and Koharu stayed in Japan a total of 10 months until Kenzie was 8 months old. Koharu returned to Boise in mid-May 1933, whereupon the Statesman interviewed her. By then, she had lived in the U.S. for 20 years and had trouble readjusting to certain Japanese customs, such as kneeling on the floor or sitting there. By then, Koharu preferred a good old American rocking chair for real comfort. During the early to at least the mid-1930s, many of the Treasure Valley's Japanese residents were obsessed with baseball. In August 1932, for example, Eddie Miyake, manager of and pitcher for Nampa's Japanese baseball team, was in Boise to arrange for a return game with the Outlaws. That was the name for the team from the Idaho State Prison. Miyake noted that his team had recently strengthened their batting order a great deal and expected to give the prison team a better fight. The following year, as reported by the Statesman, the Japanese team, called the Asahi or Rising Suns, was one of the strongest nines in the Nampa Twilight League and played the prisoners 2 good games at the penitentiary last year. The Outlaws won both contests 13-9 and 16-3, but Eddie Miyake, manager of the Japanese team, says this year his outfit can give the convicts a closer game. In February 1936, the Athletic Committee of Boise's Junior Chamber of Commerce considered and later approved a proposal to sponsor a game between the Nampa team and the Tokyo Giants, a professional team from Japan. The game's busy organizer, Eddie Miyake, even managed to squeeze in time for his wedding. A week later, he and his bride were in Boise for him to continue with negotiations for the game. A couple of weeks before game day, however, it was announced that the Idaho lineup would include the pick of Southwestern Idaho baseball talent, most of whom came from the Boise Mountaineers team. No local Japanese players were included. Miyake himself was drafted to be an umpire, likely for his fluency in both Japanese and English. On April 29, 1936, over 2,000 people attended the game, some 400 of whom were Japanese residents from Boise, from Nampa to Weiser, and from Eastern Oregon. The Tokyo Giants won, and the final score was a hard-fought 2-1. Besides being a baseball entrepreneur, Eddie Miyake was a celery farmer in Nampa. In mid-December 1937, he called on Governor Barzilla Clark and Commissioner of Agriculture Guy Graham and presented each man with a bundle of celery. The celery was the Idaho jumbo variety, which grows in huge bunches and at the same time has fine flavor without being stringy. And just to add an aside, if anyone would tell me where I can buy this, I'd be very grateful. Miyake said that some of the bunches taken from his field weighed as much as 12 pounds each before being trimmed. And I have a little question on here because I thought this was very unusual for a farm. And I wondered if that was celery being blanched, if anyone knows, because I know they used to do that. Anyway, it's a mystery. Pardon? Thank you. All right, good. Thank you. But do you think it is celery? Probably. Thank you. Okay. All right, good. Thanks. Okay. Once World War II began, such interethnic activities ceased. Although Idaho's Japanese residents were hauled off to incarceration camps, as were Pacific Coast Japanese families, the Yamamotos and other Treasure Valley Asian pioneers kept a low profile during the war years. Nevertheless, they were often the subjects of anti-Asian hostility. For example, the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross on Henry Fuji's lawn, and another night his daughter Mary and her baby had a narrow escape when someone shot out their front window. In addition, Henry, a member of the Nampa Rotary Club, was asked not to attend any meetings. During the war years, welcome news for the Treasure Valley's Asian American community came in the form of Lieutenant Fred Orr's wartime accomplishments. Fred was the son of W.C. Orr, the Korean man who owned several gardens in the Eagle area and who attended the fatal poker game at which his Korean employee was killed. Orr's son Fred, born in Oregon in 1919, grew up to become a World War II fighter pilot and hero. He flew Spitfires in North Africa and Sicily, was his squadron's commanding officer, and earned numerous medals. He was the first and still only Korean-American flying ace. Turning for the moment to Filipino pioneers in the Treasure Valley, historian Laurie Mercier learned that a sizable number of Philippine students were trained in the United States in the first decade of the 20th century. At least one of them even came to Boise. In late November 1902, Cebu Costello, a full-blooded Filipino boy aged 10 years, was admitted to the public schools of Boise. Cebu was brought to Boise, circumstances unknown, by Thomas Tamplin following the end of the Philippine-American War. Cebu's teacher, Mrs. O'Neill, observed that the boy is very bright and capable. He is rapidly familiarizing himself with the customs of school life and is particularly attentive and obedient. Further on in the article, not shown here, Mrs. O'Neill stated that she considers him quite an addition to the class and believed that he would have very little difficulty in keeping up with the other pupils. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1930, a Mr. Shelton, age unknown but described as a Filipino student visiting Boise, captivated the audience with his exceptional ability at the piano. Other early arrivals from the Philippines came to Idaho to harvest crops, but only in small numbers. Just a few dozen people from the Philippines are listed in the 1930 census. Filipinos continued to arrive for work opportunities, and by 1960, there were nearly 200 of them in Idaho. Later arrivals from the 1960s to the 1970s were mainly professionals, and by 1990s, there were over 100 Filipino families in the Boise area. After World War II ended, conditions began to improve for the Asian families in the Treasure Valley. In 1947, Mary Fuji Henshaw became the first Japanese-American public school teacher in Idaho, if not in the nation. Still, some parents threatened to remove their children from the school. In 1952, the U.S. finally allowed people of Japanese ancestry to become naturalized. By the 1950s, Henry Fuji was welcomed back into the Rotary Club and served as president from 1951 to 1952. And now Renae will tell us a bit about some more recent Asian immigrants to the Treasure Valley. Thank you.
And hopefully this will be the last mic adjustment of the evening. So let's see here. In the post-war decades, as urban renewal projects demolished Boise's last remaining original Chinatown buildings, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act passed through Congress, significantly reopening migration channels from Asia for the first time in nearly a century. In the decades that followed, Idaho's Asian American population grew dramatically, both in size and diversity. This most recent period of the Treasure Valley's history is the subject of oral histories compiled by a Yale University student and former Boise resident Kathy Min. These are all available on the Asian American Comparative Collection website, where they can be downloaded and read. Min's interviews document the experiences of families who arrived in Idaho as part of Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian migration that began in 1975 in response to political upheaval and war. Stories of employees recruited by HP, Micron, and other companies in the 1990s and 2000s, of Indian grocery store proprietors, of Thai restaurant owners, and of individuals who had been part of China's extensive international adoption program. Among the 20 different ethnic groups that now make up Idaho's more than 24,000 Asian Americans, however, most found themselves among peers who knew very little about their histories. One interviewee, for instance, recalled, and this is a quote, "I grew up in small towns and people were like, 'So are you Chinese or Japanese?' And I'd say, 'I'm Korean.' And they'd make a confused face. 'Is that Chinese or Japanese?' Which is why, although this fascinating period of Treasure Valley history is far too broad for us to cover tonight, we did want to close with a reminder that Idaho's long Asian American history is not just one that was foundational, but that is also ongoing. The increasingly diverse presence of Asian Americans in the Treasure Valley is the most modern chapter in a nearly 150-year-long anthology of individual histories. From the path worn by the first Chinese miners on their way to the Boise Basin and the remnants of Chinatown that sometimes lie right beneath our feet, to the railroad worker camps, family homes, truck farms, restaurants, groceries, baseball parks, nail salons, and modern tech industry, it is all a history that is worthy of inquiry and preservation. So we thank you for your interest. And I lied, it's not the last mic adjustment.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to modify the stage a little bit and begin with our Q&A session and give our speakers a moment to catch their breath. Thank you. That was an incredible presentation. While you are thinking of questions, again, my colleague Caitlin is available to, if you just raise or wave your hand or something like that, she'll be glad to come and pick up some of your questions. And we'll be ready to start that in just a couple of minutes.
I have a question if I may.
Oh, yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes, you're turning tables on me.
Where's the fettuccine?
Sorry, that's our number one question.
Oh,
After this, we'll all go out to dinner together and we'll get you some fettuccine. How about that?
That's fine.
I know.
I just wondered how the forum managed to have that name. I know it's very alliterative.
I believe it used to be served. Is that right? Yes. So 20 years ago.
Wow.
I'm sorry. Oh, that they were serving the fettuccine there? Okay, there we go. Thank you. Oh, okay, got it. I can do that. Is this good? A little bit more? Okay. I want to make sure I don't block them either.
Oh, it's fine.
All right. So again, if you have any questions, Caitlin will be glad to grab some of those. And we'll start asking. Oh, yes. Ready? Okay. Thank you. So our first question is, to what extent to what extent did racism influence the move of minority populations out of downtown Boise? To what extent did racism influence the move of minority populations out of downtown Boise?
Let's make sure this mic works. I think that, it's interesting because if you look at the history of Chinese immigrants, a lot of that racism is what pushed them into the central city to begin with. But then once that area became a more popular place to live and other, bigger buildings started moving in, more expensive buildings that often Chinese immigrants, because of the Exclusion Act laws, couldn't own, they often got pushed back out. So I think it influenced their migration patterns immensely, both into the city and then out of it. And then, of course, it played a role in, the demolishing of Chinatown neighborhood without sort of, many other parts of the history that get preserved do so because people are there to advocate for saving it. And that unfortunately wasn't much of the case in Boise's original Chinatown, although some Arthur Hart, the man who wrote the Chinatown book and Idaho historian did save a bunch of items from like the Hipsing building, for example. And so those have been preserved. So we do have some of the remnants, and then we also have archaeology that can tell us where that used to be. But I would say it played a pretty large role. Yeah.
And I think the redevelopment took out a lot of the former Asian American like businesses and so on, which was unfortunate.
So I think this is a good segue to our next question. What work is being done to continue the presence of Asian history in Idaho? Thinking about the museums, in the city, in anything you can comment on in Boise or in Idaho in general.
Well, yes, I think because we have like the Asian American Comparative Collection at the University of Idaho, we have the Idaho State Historical Museum, we have collections, small collections in other museums around. You have to only have to ask, see what they have. Things are not necessarily very well displayed or whatever, but many even small museums have small collections related to Asian Americans. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's I think a lot of times it's there. It's just right below the surface. So if you go to any number of small town museums, they will have something on Asian immigrants, but it's not always forefronted. I think that lately there's been a nice swelling of support for integrating a lot more of that history into the narratives of the city, particularly in Boise, but we see it a little bit also throughout the state.
And if you go to Lewiston, Idaho, for example, they have the former Chinese temple in the Lewis Clark Center for Arts and History, and they have exhibits and so on that go along with that. In many of our local cemeteries, you'll see either often an Asian section where there are gravestones of the early pioneers. So that's something to look for as well.
Thank you. This next question is, does most pottery used within historical Asian communities have maker's marks? And are there any stories you found doing research that you did not get to share tonight?
Well, you could do those, the ceramics.
Yeah, so this is something also we welcome you to come up and kind of check out the artifacts that we brought, but Chinese manufactured ceramics sometimes do have maker's marks. They're usually on the bottom of the bowl, and they're often what we kind of refer to as rain style marks. So they are marks that are hand painted on the bottom. And originally those were used to indicate which emperor was reigning when that item was made. And so that's how you would date it. But then because that was put on then very popular ceramics, it was also heavily imitated in later years. So although those marks appear on ceramics, they don't always indicate that it was actually made during that year. So a lot of times we'll find, Chinese bowls on archaeological sites from the 19th century, then it'll say it was made in like the Ming Dynasty or something. And it wasn't, that was a sort of a status symbol to putting the mark on there. So sometimes, yes, they do. There are other forms of Chinese ceramics that can be sourced to different potteries, primarily in the Guangdong region, where a lot of the Chinese migrants came to the United States from. And then in terms of Japanese ceramics, they are pretty rarely marked with pottery marks, but there are some pretty distinctive regional styles that can sometimes help you trace them to where they came from in Japan.
Was there another part to that question? Did we get it all?
The second part of that question was, are there any stories you found doing research that you did not get to share during a presentation?
Oh, well, I didn't know. I mean, I ended up, I know more. I have researched more on the Chinese in Idaho than other topics. And so when this came up, I thought, well, it would be easier for Renae to do the Chinese because she was very busy finishing her dissertation defense and so on. I said, oh, I'll research the Japanese and Koreans and Filipinos. Well, it was like we had access to the Idaho Statesman, and it was like I just kept going down these rabbit holes and finding these, wonderful little stories. And of course, you can't tell everything. And so there were more. I mean, there were some sad stories too that I didn't include. Various, Japanese railroad workers that came to, really sad ends because of their work. There were other stories too that were, sort of, fun and interesting, but there's not room enough, in a small talk like this, there's not room for this, but, there is plenty of opportunity. If anybody here is a student, whether in a university or just interested as a family background or just personal interest, there is so much available, and you just need to, start going to the Idaho Statesman online and just start looking. And there's a wonderful resource. And then we have, some of the books that we have up here too. Those will give you clues about where to start, because there are just many things that, yes, we could not include.
Thank you. So, oh goodness, I'm sorry about all the feedback, folks. I want to share two comments, one from our audience in person and one from online, and then move on to another question. So first, a slight correction of Takatory land. The tax bill came from 1930 on, but the land was not deeded to the Takatories until 1952.
Okay, sorry, I missed that. Takatories are here, you see, and I was trying to be careful, but I missed that.
Understood. And then another comment, this is from our online audience. The Asian American Comparative Collection contributed to the Chinese gold mining exhibit at the Idaho Museum of Mining and Geology. It's lovely.
Yeah.
So I hope everybody gets an opportunity to see that exhibit. The next question. Can we put to rest the legendary myth of the quote Chinese tunnels in downtown Boise? There are none.
Yes, please.
Let's put it to rest. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Maybe if I could amend that question, could you give a background about why that myth came to be?
Oh, yes, I think so. I believe the myth came to be because when people see anything mysterious, put that in quotes, mysterious, in an area where there were Chinese residents, then they have to attribute it to the Chinese because it's mysterious. And of course, the Chinese were mysterious. And so they must have done this. Chinese tunnels, which are, people think that there are these spaces in front of buildings in downtown cities and so on. Yes, there are these spaces, and there's an architectural term for them. They're called a sidewalk vault. And this is an area underneath the sidewalk. And often you'll see, and you still do today, glass blocks in the sidewalk, and that have been often turned purple by the sun. Well, because people don't know what these spaces are, that they attribute them to the Chinese. Well, the Chinese had nothing to do with them. They were made at the time the building was built, and they were made as a way to get items into the basement of the building without taking the goods in through the front door where the customers were going in. And so sometimes you'll see metal doors in the sidewalk, or those, and you open the doors and there were steps or there were ramps going down into these spaces. And the spaces are not, they stop at the end of each building, although in some cases they have been broken through for other reasons, or if the building has been combined into two buildings. But they were not built by the Chinese. Sometimes Chinese, if the Chinese owned the building, they might use that space for whatever purposes. But Chinese tunnels, I'm sorry, are a myth. And if you go to a place called the Pendleton Underground in Oregon, Pendleton, they may tell you that there were Chinese under there. And I have seen that place when it first opened, and there was absolutely nothing underneath but basements. And then in years later, when I went back, the basements were full of, someone had built bunks and they'd gone to all the antique stores in the area and brought in Chinese artifacts and put them in there. Yes. And so now they have, they're saying that there was an unwritten law in Pendleton. Of course, it was unwritten, an unwritten law in Pendleton saying that the Chinese had to live below ground and they could not, they could not come out. They could only come out after dark. But if you look at the census records, if you look at the census records in Pendleton, you see Chinese people listed in the census living above ground in houses and things. So the whole thing is a myth. And I am glad that whoever brought up that question did, because I'm happy to try to lay this to rest. But people love their myths and they often don't want to get rid of them.
And I'll just quickly add, in terms of Boise's Chinatown, Arthur Hart pretty solidly debunks that. He thinks that maybe it came from the Chinese launderers were digging canals for their wastewater from the laundries to go down towards the river. And he thinks maybe it came from that, but any old records you look at, any maps, any census documents, there are not Chinese people living underground. Also, we've had archaeological excavations in Boise's historic Chinatown, and there were no signs of Chinese tunnels. So
Thank you. I hope that is very thoroughly debunked. So thank you very much for that.
Too thoroughly, maybe, but
Yeah, no, that's great. This is a question again from our online, online audience. There are Chinese descendants who also grew up in Boise's Chinatown. How are their stories being documented? If you have any thoughts on that or know of anything.
Will you start with that because you've been working with the oral histories?
yeah, so I could even turn that back on the city. The Department of Arts and History has been recently conducting a number of oral histories with folks who have ties to Boise, particularly Boise's Chinatown, and they have some fantastic materials that I used in preparing my portion of this talk. There are also some older oral histories that are on file at the Idaho State Archives, and then less of the oral histories that I mentioned at the very end from Asian American residents from the post-1965 era. Less of those families have ties to Chinatown, but some do. So I don't, do you want to talk any more
Would
about
love to. Thank you. Yes. So thank you for that. And so yes, last January, our Boise City Arts and History Department started reaching out to members of the community to contribute, to invite them to contribute oral histories to our collection, describing their memories or experiences growing up in Boise's Chinatown, or if they immigrated to Boise, what that experience was like. If anybody here in our audience tonight or on our online audience has any questions about that project, is interested in potentially working with us to do an oral history interview, please come see me. Please come, reach out to us online through the boiseartsandhistory.org website. We can talk more about that and hopefully continue this work of documenting those important stories. Thank you. Our next question. Does the increased Asian population include Indian, Pakistani, and not just people from the Far East, the quote, Far East?
Yeah, definitely. I think I said it in my talk, but so Asian American, right, is a political term. It's a term that was created in the United States to describe a whole bunch of different types of, people from all over the place. So not just from East Asia, although Asian American history sort of begins with East Asian immigrants. It includes a number of other people, including South Asians, Southeast Asians, who arrive pretty soon after Chinese immigrants start showing up. And currently there's something like 20 different ethnic groups that are included in the term Asian American. And there can be different definitions of that where you look it up, but it definitely also includes not exclusively East Asians, folks from South Asia, Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, all sorts of different ethnic groups. Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question, were any Idaho Japanese sent to incarceration camps? Did they lose their homes and businesses?
Generally, no. And that's because the line was drawn. It was like Alaska. It was the western half of Washington State, the western half of Oregon, all of California, and the southern half of Arizona. And so those were the families that were sent to the 10 incarceration camps. You may have heard the term internment for this, but that is no longer used for the families who were incarcerated in these 10 large camps throughout the United States. The term internment is actually used for non-citizens who are interned or locked up by our government in times of war with their country. And so we have an actual internment camp near Kuski, Idaho, up Highway 12, and I've written a couple books about that. And these were all non-citizens, only men, who were brought there to help build Highway 12. They were coming from other internment camps where they were locked up because they were non-citizens of the United States. And you have to understand too, that many were non-citizens because they were not allowed to become citizens. They had families, often wives and very often children, who were born in the United States, but they were thought to be, in terms of World War II, they were thought to be dangerous, meaning, one man that I researched had given 50 cents to the Japanese Red Cross. Another man had ordered drill bits from Japan and as part of his business. And other people had subscribed to magazines that were in Japanese that were thought to be subversive. So these were men who were wrenched from their families and put into those were the real internment camps. There was a big one in Missoula, Montana. There were some in the South, and then the Kuski internment camp up Highway 12. So that was, but as far as taking people from Idaho and families and putting them in the camps, no, that didn't happen. And if it did, I don't know about it, but it was not supposed to happen. People actually, there was a very brief time when people could avoid the incarceration by moving to another state like Colorado or Idaho, but mostly they didn't do that because they had no family, they had no way of making a living, and so on. So they just stayed in the states where, you know, the incarceration was mandated.
Thank you. Our next question is there a good resource you can share of the plat map of the original Boise Chinatown?
Yeah, there's something called Sanborn fire insurance maps. That's probably the most detailed map you're going to find of Boise's original Chinatown. And they were produced by a fire insurance company. So they often include information like I mentioned, the Chinese laundries that would have tin or iron platted walls or clad walls in order to prevent fire danger. So they have all sorts of detail. And one of the things they often do is they labeled Chinese structures and businesses, including temples and merchants and stuff, and they'll say like, oh, drugstore or whatever. But so those are all available through the Library of Congress website. They've been digitized online. So if you went to the Library of Congress website and you looked up Sanborn maps and then Boise, Idaho, the 1888 one is where you first see it labeled as Chinatown. And then every couple of years after that, you can flip through and see kind of the development of the area.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, our very last, excuse me, there's almost. Okay, so we have two comments to close out our evening tonight. So just one, clarifying that Minidoka was an incarceration camp, not an internment camp.
Yes.
And our final comment from our online audience, not a question, but thank you for the chance to tune in from Seattle. So thank you very much to our online audience for joining us from afar. Well, before I conclude our evening and our Q&A, again, thank you all very much for attending this Fettuccine Forum event tonight, both in person and on our online audience. I'd love to give everybody a chance I'd like to invite you to fill out our surveys, either in person, the one that you found on your seat, or online. Our Zoom attendees will receive a link for that. We appreciate any feedback you have about how we can improve our experience here together. And I will mention too, our next lecture will be here at Trailhead. On February 1st, 2024. And we will be hosting Carl Brooks, who will explore 150 years of Boise's environmental history in his talk, Connected Along the Edges, How Boise's Environmental History Nurtured Community. And with that, will you please join me in giving another hand to our speakers, Priscilla and Renae.